My name is Ben Yudkoff. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm currently the chief medical officer and co-founder of Lumen Health, ketamine and esketamine interventional practice, currently located in the Boston metro area. And my background is in interventional treatments for the treatment of treatment refractory psychiatric disorders. There have been multiple proposed mechanisms of action for the efficacy of ketamine, and we'll focus on five of the ones that seem to bubble up most in the evidence. So the first and most prominent one has to do with how ketamine can induce the release of a growth hormone for the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And similar to how growth hormones in the muscle causes a muscle cell to hypertrophy and grow stronger, more able to be more muscly. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor enables brain cells to do the things that brain cells are designed to do, which are reach out and other brain cells. And those connections are called synapses. So it induces a process called neuroplasticity. This is important, firstly, because in certain models of depression, there are a dearth of these connections in the brain, and so the medicine can compel reestablishing the homeostasis that might be in a normal varying brain, the brain of someone who doesn't have depression. And it's important therapeutically because the brain, insofar as it is engaged in this more neuroplastic state, may be more readily able to lay down the hardwired tracks that are the material manifestations of things like habits, thoughts. And so a lot of us who think about ketamine not just as a biologic agent, but also as a phenomenologic agent, see a connection between these two areas, the proclivity of the brain to grow and lay more tracks, more synapses, and also the ability of the brain to adopt healthier habits, healthier mindsets. The second way has to do with a brain cell called an astrocyte. This was exciting research that came out in February of 2025. Astrocytes are not technically neurons, but they are brain cells, and they play a large supportive role to other cells in the brain, other neurons in the brain. And in the peculiar circumstance of ketamine, one of the things that was discovered was that astrocytes support brain cells that release a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. And this neurotransmitter is released in a number of different circumstances, but in particular to our circumstance, norepinephrine is released when triggering a sense of futility or hopelessness. If I attempt to endeavor in something that has a high reward, but a sense of impossibility, my brain is needing to negotiate the conflict between my motivation to go toward a particular objective versus the recognition of the impossibility to do so. If the brain determines that it is a good thing to go for, I begin an achievement process. If the brain perceives it as being impossible, I begin to engage a futility process. What the researchers found was that ketamine can essentially exhaust the astrocyte's ability to support this process. And in the absence of being able to support this process, these norepinephrine releasing brain cells are less apt to release norepinephrine. And the larval zebrafish in which these studies were done ended up persisting in activities they might have otherwise decided were futile. And the exciting thing was that the neural networks involved in this decision-making circuit are highly preserved. They're not just in larval zebrafish, but they're in higher order animals, including Homo sapiens. And so clinically, that does track with some of the reports where mood may not imminently improve with treatment, but people are now persisting in activities that can support healthy living, going to work, having a rapprochement with a loved one with whom they were arguing, or in a dependent-based relationship by virtue of the depression. People are changing things that would have otherwise seemed impossible beforehand. And as a translational psychiatrist, I wonder whether there's something translating between the neurology of that particular mechanism of action and this particular subjective effect. One of the other interesting biological components, something highlighted really early on in the research about primary mechanisms of action of ketamine, is the medicine's part and impact on a set of receptors called opioid receptors, two in particular. One is called the mu opioid receptor, and the other is called the kappa opioid receptor. The mu opioid receptor is the receptor responsible for receiving endorphins, the neurotransmitters associated with a runner's high. And so when we feel a runner's high, we feel our mood improves, we feel calmer, Neurocognitively, attention improves, and a whole bunch of downstream things come from that. And so what ketamine has been shown to do is it's been shown to repopulate the terminus of brain cells with these mu opioid receptors, which functionally makes them more sensitive to receiving endorphins. And so the brain is entering into a state when it's more able to receive endorphins, with implications for how those endorphins impact mood. The other opioid receptor, which is less studied, is called the kappa opioid receptor, which is responsible for stress-based changes pursuant to trauma. It's a receptor that communicates with the portion of the brain called the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which regulates a number of neuromodulatory, neurohumoral that control our body and our physiology. Ketamine can block that receptor. The implications of that have not been well understood in research, but for some of us who are really getting into the nitty-gritty, we wonder whether ketamine's impact on disorders such as trauma or chronic stress may be in part impacted by ketamine's effect at this particular receptor. If I haven't lost you already, there are two more. One of the most common regions in the brain when discussing psychedelic medicines is a region of the brain called the default mode network, which is this very large network in the brain that's composed of a multitude of different nodes. These nodes are responsible for self-referential thinking, for aggregating large amounts of external information and how it impacts internal information. So it's helping us connect biographical memory with interoceptive cues of how the body is feeling, with go, no go, risk reward calculations. And it's doing this, you could call it logic, but it's pre-semantic logic. There aren't words in this part of the brain. Lizards have this part of the brain, fish have this part of the brain. This part of the brain helps the animal control and negotiate complex social situations. There may be uh, particular pathologic changes in the brains of people who have depression to this particular default mode network. There may be pathological changes to how different nodes in this brain are responding to circumstance with an inclination, and this gets a little in the weeds, to overvalue negativistic appreciation for neutral stimuli. So there's a portion of the brain called the precuneus, for example. Uh, and if you were to show the brain of someone without depression a pen, the precuneus would not light up. It would be a neutral stimulus. The precuneus would have no response to it. But curiously, a neutral stimulus, a pen, shown to the brain of someone who has depression might see this portion of the brain light up as the precuneus is beginning to signal negativistic attribution, a stop signal, a non-motivational signal. Now that subjectively gets put through the machinery of our own cognition. And all of a sudden, stories begin to get woven about the pen. What's the point of the pen? I can't write anything anyway. And suddenly the pen sits in relationship with the person in a meaning place, but informed by this portion of the brain and how it relates to the world. So one of the things that happens with ketamine in particular is that while ketamine is in the system, this network ceases to be as networked. Uh, Clinically, during the treatment sessions themselves, and we'll talk about the psychedelia as the last proposed mechanism of action, the freedom from being locked into classic interpretation sometimes give people opportunities to see old things that had seemed to be true with new perspective. Suddenly, that which seemed to be true may actually be the product of perspective. And that can help a person reset meaning making and also re-challenge schema by which they hold and interpret the world, especially as it produces depressed perception or depressed feeling. The other interesting thing that's happening, and this is a little bit of hand wavy science, but when the ketamine leaves the system, people are doing functional magnetic resonance imaging of this portion of the brain, and it seems to be that the different nodes in the brain no longer exhibit a more classic depressed model. And so there's some thinking that as this network is reintegrating, the reintegration is offering something akin to like a reset. And that has implications for, again, for how the person relates to the world, understands the world, interprets internal body cues. Um, this neatly into the psychedelia, which is one of the most complicated portions to talk about I practice up in Boston. Uh, it's a liberal city, but medically conservative, smart, advancing, innovative. The conversations around psychedelia were had here in the 60s and 70s, and they didn't go so well. And there's been a tension between how to bring this element of the efficacy into conversation. And so it's couched in terms. We measure things like mysticism. We measure things like awe, wonderment, a sense of singular unity with the universe. But all of this is really, these are catchwords that are best encapsulated more globally by the concept of psychedelia. Ketamine is unique in the pantheon of substances that can induce this. The induction is quite different than things like LSD or psilocybin. Your readers may be familiar with these kinds of medications that are also being explored. But uh, when psychedelia happens for someone, and it doesn't happen for everybody, and when it does happen, it doesn't happen for every single treatment experience. But when it does, for someone who has been fettered by this ennui, by pessimism, by a sense of fatalism or nihilism, the ideas and the philosophies that come from depression, to be reintroduced to a moment of splendor, of wonder, of encountering, to use some of the theological terminology, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the frightening and enormous and fascinating mystery. Suddenly, a person can leave that experience and know that there's much more to be had outside of the confines of their depression and may inspire that person to pursue it. They're also, it's idiosyncratic, but these are the stories that you remember because they impact you. They're poetry, except they're real. People will talk about having recollections of traumatic experiences in previous versions of their lives. And instead of experiencing that recollection with a sense of guilt or vulnerability, they realized how unbelievably resilient they were that they could manage it at that time. And so there's a loosening of associations and there's a loosening of what's available to discover as truth. Uh, and it can be quite wondrous and beautiful and important. It can be frightening. It can be something with which a person needs to dialogue. But a lot of the excitement in working with ketamine and as ketamine is not just about it's not just about the biological mechanisms of action, which are exciting and you can see translate in front of you in terms of relief, but the medicine lends itself to a poetic humanism and a meeting people and a sense of discovery, which as a provider is very gratifying, and I'm sure as a patient is, it's like going to a museum, and it can be quite splendid.